This is Terrence R.J. Banks coming today from Information Age Financial Solutions with another fantastic book by Thomas Sowell. Thomas Sowell. It's Economic Facts and Fallacies. As you can see, I've earmarked so many different pages. I can't express enough about how I'm just engrossed by his writing, the way he conveys these topics, and it's just a fantastic book to get. It'll change your mind in terms of how you perceive things in general. And if we live in information age, you need to have books sometimes to bring back empirical data. It's a common word that he utilizes in his book consistently. Let me give you just a couple of excerpts here. This is page 7. Just you can see I highlighted so much and have these earmarks. Many local governments, for example, follow policies designed to attract either new business or higher income people, both of which are expected to provide more local tax revenues. Whole neighborhoods have been demolished and redeveloped with upscale housing and shopping malls as a means of revitalizing the community. Often the federal government subsidizes this operation with no consideration that the businesses and higher income people attracted there will simply be transferred from some other place, while the usually lower income people displaced are also transferred to some other place, with no benefit to the community as a whole. So we don't even think about that when we have the incentives that's provided by government. And I'm not saying there's something wrong. It's just that we go on such narratives without really looking at the after effects, because our politicians tell us to do these different things. Again, this is part of society as a whole, but it's just when you point things out like that, it just gives you a pause to think about things in a much more, clearer fashion. What else it says? Negative sum operation. And as often as it's a negative sum operation, as millions of lives are disrupted across the country and billions of tax dollars are spent demolishing neighborhoods, accomplishing nothing on a national level other than a voluntary relocation of taxpayers to places where they can get property without having to bid it away from its current owners, and involuntary relocation of the people displaced. Since policies imposed by government are not voluntary transactions like those of the marketplace, zero sum and negative sum operations can continue indefinitely. And that's the thing about it, because there's always an economic cost to anything that we do, even policies that are presented. As you see what's going on in my home state, New York, they're cutting things, these austerity measures just to cover the new situation, what's going on with the transplants with migrants. And it's having a ripple effect from everything from sanitation, it's bringing back like this the 80s again. And it's just a shame to see. I'm just using New York as a backdrop because I grew up there most of my young adult life, and then I was born there, grew up there, and I moved out when I was in my 20s from there. Now, I keep going back and forth about that, but I just thought about the recent things that just came now with the new budget cuts, and to see just where it's moving back, and just history repeats itself because of bad policies. What else can I read on this book? It's just most cities were built before there were motorized vehicles on land or water, or in course in the air. The most fundamental fact is that land transport has always been far more costly than water transport, and especially so during thousands of years before the invention of cars, trucks, and trains. Even today, it is often cheaper to ship goods thousands of miles by water than to ship them hundreds of miles by land. A city must continuously transport vast amounts of food alone to feed a concentrated population, and must also transfer out the goods it produces to markets elsewhere in the country or around the world. I'm doing a bad job of that. So that's you explaining that just understanding the cost of how much it takes to, depending on where you're located, the city would cause the differences in terms of how things are, things being presented to the population that's there. And why I'm using that as a factor is that I grew up in a impoverished neighborhood. I grew up in especially in New York City, and always the cost of the goods there, especially bodegas, the little stores that were there, was always more expensive. And I always thought it was like, well, maybe it might be something because you're just born in this area and maybe some level tied to some racism. Come to find out that as I became, study economics a little bit more, that is economies of scale. And so sometimes I'm not saying this is the answer for everything, but sometimes when you're trying to, if you're from an economic standpoint, it's easier to transport things to a one box store where the cost will be cheaper because you're just putting it to there instead of going to many different cities and stuff like that. The cost becomes more expensive. We're not even talking about the level of crime that might be situated. So everything is not as black and white as they make it seem, and he shows that throughout this book consistently. Even things from what we think of third world countries needs to be changed, how we view things in history, housing, racism. Everything needs just to be looked at and bring it to empirical data and giving more of a complete look at why things are than just going by anecdotal sounding points that we go by from our political transport, because they only hear it for a short period of time and they're looking out to serve their interests. This book is just unbelievable in terms of how much fascinating information he provides with empirical data. Really, it's empirical data that goes on, and he uses that. Respect for property rights means that existing residents and potential newcomers compete for the same space on an equal basis in the marketplace, rather than in a political process in which only the existing residents can vote. While existing residents may choose to believe that they might have a right to protect the community against outsiders by using the power of government, the Constitution of the United States requires equal protection of the law to everyone regardless of where they happen to live or how long they have lived there. Moreover, what existing residents choose to call our community is in fact not their community. Each resident owns only the private property which that particular resident has paid for. Those existing residents who have chosen to sell to developers have just as much right to do so under the Constitution as those who prefer to keep the community as it is. And sometimes you see these fights in terms of communities where they don't want new building to come in, or they're fighting against that, and they're making the situation or change the situation. But again, this is the point of the Constitution. It goes against that. So it's just interesting to think about it from another standpoint. What else? I'm just cutting a couple of excerpts here, but again, can't encourage you to read this book. And what is this part? During the 1960s, one neighborhood in San Francisco had the lowest income, the highest unemployment rate, the highest proportion of families with incomes under $4,000 per year, the least educational attainment, the highest tuberculosis rate, and the highest proportion of standard housing in any area of the city. That neighborhood was called Chinatown. Yet in 1965, there were only 5 persons of Chinese ancestry committed to prison in the entire state of California. Something interesting to know. So poverty is not an excuse for crime. Just putting it that simply in that point, he's using that as a backdrop. When the owners of small businesses like restaurants, barbershops, or hardware stores own a building where their business are carried on, they have typically invested not only in acquiring a building, but also have invested years of effort in developing reputations of contacts that continue to build their clientele. Moreover, their clientele may over the years become far more valuable than their building. Yet when the government decides to level that part of town and replace existing homes and businesses with some new redevelopment, it compensates the owners of these businesses only for the value of the physical structure, not for often the much larger value of the loss of their clientele, which is extremely important because everything is built on relationships, especially in business. Here's a chapter 3, male-female facts and fallacies. In most societies, for most of the history, women have earned lower incomes than men. The fact is not in dispute. What is often in open to question has been generated many fallacies. There have been various attempts to explain the fact. There's no question that the sexes have often been treated differently from childhood on. In some societies, girls have not been educated as often as, or to some extent, as boys. But the question remains is that difference in the question rather than a foregone conclusion, because for whatever reasons, differences in job qualification between women and men had often been demonstrable and substantial. Even in the 21st century, 2/3 of the world's illiterate adults are women, according to The Economist magazine. Again, some of this stuff may be hard to swallow because you're hearing all this stuff, especially in the day and age where we can't even take different information. However, at the other end of the educational spectrum, women in most industrially advanced countries are going on to higher education numbers comparable to men, and in some countries more often than men. In Japan, there are 90 women enrolled in higher education for every 100 men in the United States, 140 women for every 100 men, and in Sweden, 150 women for every 100 men. This is good information here. Nor is such predominance of women purely quantitative. In 2006, the New York Times reported at elite institutions like Harvard, small liberal arts colleges like Dickinson Hume College, like the University of Wisconsin, UCLA, and smaller ones like Florida Atlantic University, women are walking off with a disproportionate share of the honors degree. But these are developments in the relatively recent times. China, again, example, China is, but what is the difference between them? Why we go there? Other economic consequences included reductions of male-female pay differentials even before laws were passed mandating equal pay for equal work. Another physical difference between women and men is childbearing has continued to have major economic consequences, which is logical. Mothers as a group tend to fall first behind men in income as competing domestic responsibilities, reduced ability of women with babies and small children to be able to maintain continuous full-time employment in the workforce. The factor is especially important when it comes to high levels of achievement in the most demanding professions. In the arts and sciences, 40 is the mean age at which peak accomplishment occurs, preceded by years of intense effort, mastering the discipline in question. These are precisely the years during which most women must bear children if they are to bear them at all, which could be a factor that's not even considered when they're talking about the economic differences in terms of the pay gaps. Difference in higher education, professional occupancies. Some women tend to take different occupancies as a whole, which will may pay less. In reality, the proportion of women in professions of the high-level positions were greater during the first decades of the 20th century than in the middle of the 20th century, and then all this was before anti-discrimination laws or the rise of feminist movement. For example, the proportion of women among the people listed in Who's Who in America in 1902 was more than doable in the proportion 1958. A study published in 1964 concluded the period of the first 2 decades of the 21st century was the heyday of academic women. The trend of women as a percentage of academics was up from 1910 to about 1930 and down thereafter with a possible upward trend in recent years according to the same 1964 study. Hard data substantiates this pattern. In 1921 and again in 1932, the proportion of women among people receiving doctoral degrees was about 17%, but this was down to 10% by the late 1950s and early 1960s. This general pattern was common across a number of fields. In the biology sciences, women would receive from 1/5 to 1/4 of the doctorates in the 1930s, but only 1/8 of the 1950s. In economies, women's share of doctorates declined from 10% to 2%. A closer scrutiny of facts suggests that what changed over these decades was not employer discrimination, but women's marriage and childbearing patterns, which is nothing wrong with that. So we've gotten so conditioned of hearing these narratives that we never really looked at it to more closely to get really a lot of empirical data and put into other things that come in place. This even can describe for even families itself. In a normal family, you're going to have differences between brothers and sisters. I know it happened different in my family. So levels of achievement may be different in the family member. We don't question that. We just put blanket policies in terms of and saying one size fit all when human beings are completely different. And a lot of achievement comes on later on when you're in your life. It's just fascinating when you really think about these things. One of my favorite chapters was Third World Facts and Fallacies in Chapter 7. How explaining that countries, I'm just going to read the beginning of this. Countries contrast between the prosperity of Western nations and the dire poverty of some third world countries arouse many emotions and provoke many inquiries onto how such things can be done. How such things can be. While such inquiries have turned up many facts, a failure to distinguish between causation and blame has produced many fallacies. Since virtually unlimited numbers of sins can be found in the history of any branch of the human race, there will seldom be a lack of bad episodes that can be cited by those who seek to explain causation by blame. A book title captured much of this confusion, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. Europeans certainly committed many sins in Africa, and North Africans committed not a few sins in Europe. North Africans' Barbary Coast pirates alone enslaved more Europeans than were Africans taken in bondage to the United States, and North Africans' Moors invaded and subjected Spain for centuries. He gives data showing that here. Such depredations and atrocities were by no means confined to Europeans and Africans. Asians, Arabs, Polynesians, and the indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere also shown a history very similar in this respect in its broad outlines. However, it differs in specific details from one part of the world to another. The confusion between blame and causation is likewise not confined as issues involving Europeans and Africans. Many blame the poverty in South Americans on North Americans, on the poverty of India, on British colonial rule in the subcontinent. Sometimes, of course, blame and causation may coincide, just as a historic event may coincide with the spring equinox, but they are still two different things despite such overlap. And I'm reading over this very quickly. I devoured this book, and I just kept reading it back again to even find out other points that just some things I'll be missing. I encourage everyone to read books like this, especially as we continue to go in an age where more understanding and we should move to finding out more information will give us a broader understanding how some things remain the same. Geographics, another big part that he talks about in this book, and how that could also describe, how well a country or a population prospers, because they have access to different individuals. When you combine effort, you can learn more things in that point. And that could also show the prosperity sometimes where you see small groups of people take over large land. That's because they just don't have access to different things. And that's because the geographics is one thing. Clever climates, all of the factors that can be explained, that we just tend to believe that it's always usually something of nefarious thing. And sometimes it's just what it is, because of that's just the point about it. That may not be, extrapolate that out, that may not be the best sentence I used in that case. But this book, I can't begin to give it justice. Thomas Sowell, for my college report, I used to use his work, and I never really paid attention to him. And I had to do it because this is some years back. I'm dating myself. But as I've gotten older, his work has become even more, it's just been more fascinating, more eye-opening as time goes on, because there's so many things that it's not what it seems to be and how it's being explained. And data can be utilized and extrapolated in a different sense. He even gave it into here where it's only a 17% difference, but the way it was described, especially for, I think it was a banking issue, where one population was being discriminated against, and it didn't even include Asians in the thing, where Asians had more than Caucasians in terms of receiving loans, and they didn't use that as the data. They only pointed out, showing that, hey, this group is being marginalized and not getting the same treatment. And if they look at it as a whole, you can't leave out a whole population that didn't have more preferential treatment. They just receive more loans than even the Caucasians at this point. And I'm always using race becomes a factor in this as well, and that's where the economic facts and fallacies needs to be really examined. And Thomas Sowell, just to open up your idea again, he doesn't give you conclusions. He just gives you, well, he does give conclusions, but he does just give you a broad spectrum using empirical data. Just everything is not exactly how it's being presented to us, and if it's not extrapolated out to, we think about it and we could look at the empirical data that goes along with it, we could come to conclusions that most likely are sometimes false. Can't say enough about this book. Go buy it. Not being paid or compensated in any form or fashion. I just really enjoy this man's writings, and I didn't appreciate him enough when I was in college when I had to use his reports, because I only used them a couple of times. But as I've gotten older, and I seek knowledge, this book is just chock full of just vital information. This video has been a value to you. Please subscribe, leave some comments. Until my next video for Information Age Financial Solutions, I'm out.